Okay, so as I said earlier, this is our second session in our Leadership of SEND, Building a Culture of Collective Responsibility. That's our theme. My name's Sarah Watson, and I'm the Deputy Regional SEND Lead for Whole School SEND for the North region. We've already had one session in this series. So if you haven't seen that, I really would urge you to go back and watch the recording or look at the slides, download the resources. Malcolm Reeve, the National SEND Leader, gave us a really useful overview of data, and he included lots of different resources linked to Ofsted. So please go and have a look at that if you haven't already. Today's session is really focused on case studies from SENCO colleagues. So we have 4 case studies this afternoon. And then coming up in January, we have our third and final session, which is going to focus on phase and curriculum leaders. With this theme of collective responsibility, it's really important that our phase and curriculum leaders understand their responsibilities for SEND. And we've really been looking at all of the inspections that have occurred over the last term. And we've looked at arising themes, and early reading and reading for pleasure is coming up again and again when we speak to colleagues. So we're going to have quite a detailed case study looking at early reading in our next session. And at Whole School SEND, we've been working on pulling together all the data from autumn inspection reports, and we'll have a document to share some of the key themes and outcomes with you. That'll be shared in the session in January. Okay, so we left the last session reflecting on key questions as a SENCO. How do you prepare for an Ofsted inspection? So this is one of the documents shared in the previous session, so that's available online. Today then, our session objectives are sharing practical strategies for implementing this collective responsibility. So from SENCO colleagues who are in the job, and how are they raising that profile of SEND and that responsibility. They're going to reflect on key questions, but this isn't really going to be a session where we just list all of the questions that Ofsted ask. We've picked some key ones to talk about, and then at the end we will share a list of all the questions asked on the day. And we're going to look at how we can use the inspection framework to help drive improvements in SEND provision. Okay, so we have had a few technical issues, so we're going to go to Cheryl Tyndall first from Trinity Academy in Doncaster. So I'm just going to stop sharing for a moment so Cheryl can share her slide.
Okay, is that coming up all right?
Yes, that's great.
Brilliant. Okay, so my name is Cheryl Tyndale. I'm a SENCO at Trinity Academy in Doncaster. So in terms of the school background, it's born as an ex-mining community. So this is where Trinity is located. We've got over 1,260 students on roll, and 162 of those are on the SEN register. So the social deprivation level within the area is quite significant in comparison to the national average. Now, prior to December 2013, we were rated outstanding by Ofsted. We then went to inadequate and have been in requires improvement ever since. We had a recent inspection at the end of October, last half term. So I'm just the key areas that I've made over the last few years for improvement, but then also some of the key elements that Ofsted asked about and how I showed them to staff and how we could make sure that you will be able to show them to Ofsted themselves. So in terms of improvements, one of the key areas was obviously what we're discussing today, encouraging the collective responsibility for SEN provision, an emphasis on quality first teaching, clear intervention programmes within the department, accessible SEN support plans, making sure they're fit for purpose, making sure teaching staff are able to access strategies in the classroom, and increased parental communication. Outside of the school, we've been trying to make sure we create trusting relationships with the local authority SEND team, increased LSA training and responsibility, which was one of the questions that an Ofsted inspector did ask myself about, and then also checked on this, on my answer, with one of our learning support assistants as well. And then clear provision to reduce repeated fixed term exclusions and increase attendance with SEND students. So if I just focus today on how to encourage a collective responsibility. One of the key things that I felt as though had an impact was describing the process of an Ofsted inspection to all of the staff, emphasising the fact that there is a need for triangulation of information. What you say in that initial meeting, what they see in the classroom, and what they speak to the student about. What are they going to see in the books? Is everything you're telling them evidenced? And it can't just be a one-off, can't just be them scaffolding just for that lesson because the inspector's there. It needs to be shown that this is a general practice, this is a normal way of working. So ways I did this was getting involved in learning walks and deep dives across the school within departments, random lesson drop-ins. Okay, staff are getting used to me popping in to see students to look in their books, but also on a more formal level, book scrutiny with heads of department and giving feedback on how they can make this better. Now, I've sent Sarah a document that I know is going to be circulated after this presentation that has got a list of questions that the Ofsted inspector asked myself, but also a list of questions that was asked to the learning support assistant and to the students, but as though that was surrounding this element of collective responsibility, which was how does the EHCP inform the structure of the curriculum? So I got this question on day 2 and it really threw me off. So what I started to think through was this element of collective responsibility. So how does the EHCP inform the structure of the curriculum? Now, in order to encourage this element of collective responsibility, I discussed with the inspector about how we have a 3-pronged approach, I should say, to our training. So I'm going to show you some examples now of some CPD and some training that I've done with staff that ultimately fed into the answer to that question, which I'll show you at the end. So, for example, during an all-staff CPD session, I asked the question, is the student able to reach the same outcome as their peers? If not, what can you put in place to help them get there? Now, what I found through talking with staff is that the word scaffolding is thrown around a lot, but actually they want examples. They want you to show them what to do with different needs, what actually is scaffolding. So it'll look different for different students. Some might require more support than others. One of the key themes that I found to encourage collective responsibility was emphasising the term individualised learning. Now, we've all heard it during teacher training, but individualised learning is not just for children who are on the special needs register. It's for every single child in that classroom. So scaffolding and differentiation should never be limited just to special needs students. It should be limited to every student in that classroom. But what I've said to staff is they're most likely to find that students on the special needs register will need it. We discussed how over longer periods of time scaffolding will reduce to show the students making progress, and how not all SEN students, so for example high functioning autism, might not need scaffolding in their books, but you can clearly see that they're making the same level of progress as their peers. So something's happened in that lesson. One of the factors that some staff found really useful, so this checklist, some of them printed this out and put it in their folder. So different suggestions as to how they could scaffold or differentiate for students with different categories of need. So following speaking to all staff during CPD, I then worked within departments. Now, I found this the most useful part. Speaking with a head of department who actually develops the curriculum journey for their subject has created an element of SEND built into that part of the curriculum. And this helped inform my answer to the inspector. So, for example, the head of science gave me this, and she said, how would we encourage a student with SEND to write an answer like this? So working with the head of department, I showed them how they could create a structure strip. So how they could split the answer into 5 stages, for example. Use pictures, use coloured themes, use sentence starters, and then how for certain students they can start to take these away. I delivered this training to the science department, and from there I'll then visit the science department once a week, and it's got to a point now where they could ask me questions. It also meant that I knew when I was walking the school with the inspector which lessons they were really going to see the extent to this collective responsibility, to this developing collective responsibility that we have in the school. It helped direct my discussion, it helped direct my route. From here, from the deep dives, I've been working with individual staff. So this is an example of a staff member who wanted some individual direction on how different students with differing needs can actually reach the same endpoint. So during the inspection, I could take the inspector to this actual lesson and show him this piece of work as an example. And the positive feedback that the inspector gave was good, and because he could see my response on paper. He could speak to the teacher and he could speak to the head of department, and he knew he was going to get the same answer and this element of collective responsibility. So when I answered the question, how does the HCP inform the structure of the curriculum? The answer that I gave, access to the curriculum is a collective responsibility. Developing the tone for a collective responsibility is key to ensuring that training and practice are evident across the school. Ensuring that each student is able to access the curriculum is the responsibility of the teacher through quality first teaching. So, the student with an EHCP does not inform the curriculum, rather the teacher, the head of department and the SENCO ensure that through appropriate training and scaffolding, each student has the potential to access the curriculum themselves.
So I am the assistant head teacher in SENCO at St Therese Catholic Primary School in Stockton-on-Tees. It is a small one-form entry school with currently 213 children on roll. We have very low numbers of children from disadvantaged backgrounds, and we are part of a multi-academy trust. We currently only have 10 children on our SEND register, which I'm sure some of you are cursing me right now, so we only have 10 on our register. A little bit about myself. I only started at the school last September as the assistant head teacher, and I became the SENCO this September, and our Ofsted inspection was at the beginning of October. So I was very much thrown into an Ofsted inspection within my first 5 weeks in role. Could you just go to the next slide, Sarah, please? So again, on the theme of collective responsibility, we had similar deep dives, obviously, to the previous speaker, and it was very much about the collective responsibility. High on Ofsted's agenda was the triangulation, and that was across everything, not just SEN, but everything that they questioned was then triangulated with teachers, SLT, the subject leaders, and also support staff. So it was really, it's really important to make sure that everybody is involved with your SEND children. So I've been asked to speak about one of the strategies that we do use at St Therese, which came across really strong with Ofsted. And obviously, as the previous speaker said, the key questions which you would all be expecting, which I know was discussed in your previous webinar, about what barriers to learning that the children in your school have, your SEND children have. And one of the things that Ofsted asked myself was for a child case study with that. So they actually wanted me to discuss one child on my register, and they wanted to know what the barriers to learning was, what we did about them and how we overcome them. And obviously had a high emphasis on that high quality first teaching. One of the big things that we use at St Therese is we use pre-teaching sessions prior to lessons. And this is to try to ensure that the SEND children, not just the SEND children, any child who needs a little bit of extra support prior to a lesson, that they have a pre-teaching session so that they can then access the curriculum alongside their peers. Our pre-teaching sessions focus on introduction to key vocabulary that's going to be introduced within the lesson. It exposes them to the key concepts prior to the lesson, and it just gives them that little bit of pre-teaching so that they then have the confidence to then take part in the main lesson in the classroom. What Ofsted were particularly interested in, and what came out as a huge strength of ours, was that our pre-teaching sessions are led by the teacher, and what came across really well was the fact that, you know, we use the expertise of the teacher to lead these sessions, because we know that as a teacher, you know what the previous learning was for those children, you know what the gaps are for those children, you know where your lessons are going. So it was really important to ourselves as a school. So we didn't, you know, it's not just for Ofsted, but it's really important to us that we have that teacher led, so that it is fits in with your sequence of learning, and you know those children more than anybody. So that was just a huge strength, that it was teacher led. What else that Ofsted liked was that we have that proactive approach, so that you know, that you do obviously still need to have your interventions, and some children will require more support than others. We've got children that have the pre-teaching sessions, but then will still need a same-day intervention as well. However, what they did like was that we have that proactive approach. We're getting in there first before those children struggle within a lesson. So we're preempting what they need. And then obviously we react following the lessons. Ofsted did ask to see pre-teaching sessions. They then followed that into the lesson and saw the difference in those children, how they were confident to share their ideas, they were putting their hands up, they were able to access the lesson alongside their peers. So it's a really big positive approach that we're using at St. Therese, and Ofsted could see that in practice as well. And again, the same day interventions, they looked at it in a lesson situation. They identified that there was children in a particular maths lesson who were struggling, and they wanted to see what was going to happen that day. And obviously we were able to say to them, well, later on today there'll be a same day intervention with them children, because the teacher actually identified that in the lesson as well. So it was again, just say Ofsted were just checking that what I had said was actually happening within the lessons that they went into. Obviously, because of the context of St. Therese and our small SEN register, my meetings with Ofsted were about the bottom 20% as well. And I'm also the phonics lead and reading lead. So I had a deep dive into early reading. And what again, Ofsted really liked about our reading was that, yes, we do have low proportions of SEN, and our bottom 20% still achieve quite high as well. However, the challenge is there. We have the rising aspirations. So what they liked was the fact that, yes, you do only have to get 32 out of 40 on the phonics screening to pass. But for our school, for our context, we're saying, you know, well, no, we want them to be getting 40 out of 40. We want them to be getting that 100%. And that's, they really liked that we were striving for that and had the high expectations of all our children, including SEN and the bottom 20% as well. Could you go to the next slide, Sarah? Obviously, with Ofsted, you'll get the questions that you're expecting. You'll have read examples of questions, you'll have seen the framework, and all of those things did come up. But one of the things that threw me a little bit, and it took me a little bit of extra time after my meeting to find this information, was that they really homed in on the personal development of the SEN children. And again, they asked for case studies of this. So what they asked me was, what percentage of my SEN children attend an after school club? Well, obviously I didn't have that on hand, so I was able to go and pull that information up for them. However, I only have the 10 children, so our percentage of take up on that is very small. But what they wanted to know is why do they not attend after school clubs? And, you know, with the best will in the world, some children just don't want to attend an after school club, whether they've got a special educational need or not. But what they wanted to home in on your SEN children. How do you ensure that they've got the same opportunities as every other child? So how do you make sure that the after school clubs are tailored for those children as well as everybody else? How do you make sure that your educational visits can include those children? Your residentials, is there any barriers with residentials that you need to overcome? And what came out of that was about your pupil voice representation, and it is something that we've come away with and had a little bit of a think about, and within our multi-academy trust we had a little bit of a discussion about this last week, in that a lot of schools might do speeches to be head boy or head captains, PE captains or whatever, and straight away that can not be inclusive of some SEND children. So what we're looking at now following our inspection is making sure that we look at our pupil voice representation and making sure we have got a wide range of the children, a broad balance of the different abilities, the different interests of the children as well. And another further development of ours is just to ensure that our SEN is built into all CPD, so we will have staff meetings that focus on SEN within school. But what I think is really important moving forward for ourselves is that SEN is built into all of our CPD. So if we've got a CPD session on phonics or reading or maths, that there is that SEN built into that, to ensure that, again, it's that triangulation, so that it's not just me learning how that happens, but that everybody within the school. And that's me finished, I think, Sarah, if that's okay.
Hi there, my name is Meg Holmes and I'm the SENCO at Archbishop Holgate School, which is a secondary academy school in York. We are part of the Multi-Academy Trust Pathfinder. We are the only secondary school in that trust, and we are a school of 1,800, which includes a sixth form, and serve a really wide catchment and local community. We have over 40 feeder primary schools into our school, and we have recently had our Ofsted inspection, where we have had the result of outstanding in every single area, and really importantly, and what we're very proud of, is with no areas of improvement. So our recent report can be found on our website, but I'll put the link onto it there. We have been in that category of outstanding, where we were exempt from previous inspections for some time now, so we were overdue. And it's the first time that we have been inspected under the new inspection framework. So I'm really pleased to be able to share that result and kind of share best practice and talk about what that inspection looked like from a position of a SENCO and looking at a SEND department. So I've been teaching for 6 years, 5 years at Archbishop Holgate School, and I've been the SENCO for 2. I've just recently qualified with my SENCO qualification, and this was my first inspection as a SENCO under the new framework. So when we're thinking about collective responsibility for SEND as our first objective here, it was really important, and it always has been for me, to make sure that collective responsibility is really clear across our whole school. It's important for all schools, and important for every SENCO. At the moment, I am the only SENCO that serves a very wide set of needs in a large secondary school, and therefore I've always said since starting this job role that it's not just me, it's not just the SENCO that is in charge of SEND, it's the responsibility of all, and all teachers are teachers of SEND. So in terms of how did we show this during our inspection, there's lots of things that we could talk about. There are 2 key areas I think easy to share that hopefully people might find useful. The first one was our student information sheets. So of itself, I don't think this is necessarily a revolutionary idea, but the way that it was presented from a SEND perspective, it was really pleasing for our Ofsted inspector to see. So we have mark books or student information sheets that are for every class, for every teacher across the whole school. And what this means is that when a teacher is planning and designing curriculum and lesson plans, they have the information of the class in front of them. They have raw data about subgroups and categories, and they have previous data, Key Stage 2 data and projected grades, but importantly from my perspective, they have the SEND data as well. So the information that is on our SEND register is pulled through to collate whole class lists, and you can see the SEND information for each class as it stands alone. This first of all shows that there is information being shared, it shows information is accessible, that it is taken into account by individuals, teachers, but most importantly is that on that student information sheet there is a whole column designed for strategies to be used in that lesson. So there's the information that I've given on description of need, on strategies that I think are useful for that particular child, but then there's space for the teacher, the class teacher themselves, to show their responsibility for their looking after that child in their class and what strategies they're using. So the textiles teacher, the history teacher, the maths teacher can all do this independently, and it'll look slightly different because they're meeting the needs of the learner in front of them in that moment. This was really, really useful when answering lots of questions, which we'll come on to, regarding the inspector's queries on this. But it was lovely to be able to say that this was consistent across the board. All teachers are using them. When I was asked to provide examples of these, I said no. I said go and look in every single classroom across the next 2 days. They are there. Every teacher has done this, and that was really, really powerful to show them the engagement that we had in this across the school. The second thing that was really useful to show the collective responsibility of SEND across the whole school was our nurture group. Our nurture group is designed entirely around cognition and learning, where I think lots of nurture groups are focused on social emotional mental health or speech, language and communication needs. Ours are designed on cognition and learning. And what this means is that from 7s right through to year 11, there is a group of 12 students who usually have school assistant support in their class as well, are accessing the full curriculum but at a differentiated and slower pace that meets the needs of the learners in that group. In year 7 and 8 and 9, this is seems to be following a very similar setup to the rest of the year 7, 8s and 9s in terms of accessing the full curriculum. By Key Stage 4, we're looking at an applied learning pathway that meets the needs of the learners in terms of GCSE or equivalent subjects that are most appropriate for them to be taking in terms of pathways. This was really, really helpful to talk about the collective responsibility for SEND across the school, because this is entirely put into the hands of the curriculum leads and the teachers that are working with these classes. So heads of department, curriculum leads have to ensure that their curriculum is designed so that it is accessible, that it is aspirational, that it is inclusive, it has really high expectations, that it meets the requirements across the piece for every single year group, but it is delivered in a way that is accessible and allows these individual children to be successful. So that was another really successful way to say that actually we do have collective responsibility for SEND across the whole school, from pastoral to teaching and learning as individual class teachers, and in terms of our planning and delivery of our curriculum. Linking to those two pieces, these are some of the questions that were asked of me by the inspector. So to set the scene, we had a 2-day Section 5 inspection. On the first day, there was a planned half-an-hour interview with myself as SENCO. I had the head teacher sit with me for that also. They asked us at the same time. And that was a full half an hour of all sorts of questions that I don't think were particularly surprising, and we felt prepared for. At the end of the half hour, it was clear that it wasn't long enough. There was too much to talk about, which was a really positive thing. And after the first day, where they were doing other deep dives across the curriculum, the inspector that was looking at SEND asked for a full 2 hours with me on the second day, which was to finish off an interview, but also include a learning walk across the school. She was very, very clear that I think she liked what she heard, but she really wanted to see it in action, which I think is fair enough and to be expected, and it was a really good morning. So going back to the areas of collective responsibility and linking to the student information sheet in the nurture group, these were some of the questions that were asked of me that I could answer with the previous points. So in terms of identifying need and tracking need, very, very clear on that, and looking at transition and all that sort of stuff around identification. How do you relay that information, share that information, store that information? How do you train staff on the information that you are giving them? How do you SENCO manage the workload and responsibility of all of what we've just talked about there? How do you know that staff are meeting those needs in the classroom? What evidence do you have of that? And that's where the SIS sheet really, really came into its own. That student information sheet answered a lot of those questions for me and could create a real focus point around conversations of SEND there. The second area, again, was answered a lot by the nurture group, and going on those learning walks and seeing it in action. What are the primary needs of your school? Do they match the local area needs? How do you know about that? How do you communicate that? Is that linked to the national picture? How are you meeting those needs, and how does the curriculum meet the needs of all learners? Is it designed that way? How do you make sure it is designed that way whilst also being broad, aspirational, inclusive, having high expectations? How do you monitor it across the key stage 3 to 4? lots and lots of things around that area. So these are just two very, very brief, as it were, simple examples of things that we did, linking to collective responsibility across SEND, and also kind of tying in some of these key questions that were covered in those 2 days. For the last part of the objectives of today, thinking about the inspection framework and how this helps drive improvements in SEND provision, I think that we were already doing this regardless of Ofsted, and I think that we were really prepared for the Ofsted inspection in terms of SEND, but it really did highlight and underline and put in bold the importance of SEND across the whole school. I think lots of staff have recognised that, you know, I had 3 hours basically of one-to-one with this Ofsted inspector, and it really shows the importance of SEND and getting it right across the school. It showed how much it comes down into the curriculum, into planning, into delivering, into teaching and learning, into training, into best practice, into observations and feedback around the curriculum, and that SEND falls directly under them as well. The pastoral were asked about communications and working with families and working with children with SEND needs, and how does that all link together. And the communications, yes, internally between, you know, school staff, how do we relay information and work best to pass those nuggets of information on about SEND and how to work with children and families, but also how do we work with external agencies and also with families and other, you know, primary schools or schools in terms of transition. So the importance of SEND was just across the whole board, not just the SENCO, not just the inclusion centre, across the whole school. I think the inspection framework really has driven that improvement across the board. And then secondly, I think the most important one for me is about the resourcing of SEND and SEND departments, not just me as a SENCO, the whole department, the school assistant team, the inclusion centre, interventions, and then also resourcing in terms of CPD and training, and the time allocated for strong transition, strong paperwork, strong meetings that back up all the things that we do day in, day out. And I think that that's something that as a school I know that we will be looking at carefully about how we improve the resourcing of our SEND team.
So yes, so my name is Rachel Dance and I'm the SENCO at Familgate School, Durham. I just wanted to start out really by giving you an overview of our school context. So we have 1,300 students on roll. 202 of our students are on the SEND register, of which 19 have an EHCP, and we've got 8 EHCPs in progress. And we have 56 students that appear as English as an additional language. We have 347 of our students who are pupil premium, 12 students who are looked after, as well as 7 young carers. So it just gives you a bit of an overview of our school. We actually had our inspection last academic year, and we were delighted to get the call on the last 2 days prior to the summer holidays, which was a great way to start the 6 weeks. I was really impressed with our outcome. We were originally, it requires improvement, but thankfully after our Ofsted, we came out with a rating of good. So needless to say, it was a really good Ofsted inspection for ourselves. So I think, as everyone's already said, it's so important that as a SENCO you don't take the responsibility of SEND on yourself, and it's about really looking at the responsibility being across the board. It's collective. So in doing that, what I'm going to talk about today is just a few ideas, what we do, what Ofsted really liked, and how that really focuses upon the collective responsibility. So some of you may or may not be aware of Tom Sherrington's books. They seem to be doing the round quite a lot in education at the moment. And we use the 5-step guide to instructional and coaching. So learning walks and book scrutiny is something that Ofsted were really keen and looking at how we actually address that within school. So we historically used to do learning walks and we'd give feedback, and we'd also do a book scrutiny, but actually following the 5-step guides to instructional and coaching, and more importantly, looking at walkthroughs too, as a new book that came out, it's about the coaching mechanism that's really important. So we actually, as a collective of senior leadership team, as well as middle leaders, we use the coaching strategy, and it's about being able to go in and do a learning walk, but follow up with coaching strategies. So I think what's really difficult is when we're working with staff and actually we're just asking them to improve, but then we're not working with them to coach with them. So actually what we look at is planning curriculum, explaining and modelling, questioning feedback, practice and retrieval, as well as twice weekly learning walks within school, with the focus being on SEND plans. So every week I go out, I go into my classrooms, I speak to my staff, I speak to the students and find out exactly what's going on there. And I will give them feedback on the day. So the idea is that they're not waiting around. I give them a little bit of a hint and tip of some feedback feedback that I want them to work on, and then I would go back and revisit that. I would look at that in around about every 2 to 3 weeks to go back and visit that same member of staff. Has it worked? Has it not? What can we work on next time? How can I support them? And it's really important that we look at that coaching model. So implementing the coaching model, it's about reflecting on how this has impacted the teacher's responsibility for SEND. And I think what's really important with this coaching model is that you're not just giving advice to staff, but you're actually modelling that with them. So what we do is we sit together and we'll just be 10-minute session and we'll talk about ideas. How can we improve that lesson? How can we ensure that our SEND students aren't being forgotten about and they're really being heavily supported? And we will do some maybe role modelling. We'll look at how we can structure the lesson maybe differently. And it's about that planning of questions for next lesson, the scaffolding of resources, maybe coming up with some questions and role playing those. It might seem quite a strange way to do it, but actually the impact's been huge. And we've really seen quite a lot of staff finding that not only helpful, but it's improved their confidence and empowered them within the classroom to support our students with SEND. We review them, as I say, every 2 to 3 weeks. And the idea is that the staff over time start to then move their ideas onto their colleagues. I've tried this, we've worked on this, and actually this really works. And they can then pass that on and model and coach beyond that. So it's not just about taking our learning walks and having that conversation with a member of staff. It's about taking it one step further and coaching a member of staff through their difficulties, being able to help them, modelling. In our book scrutiny, we've changed that from just asking for books to be handed in, and we actually do that sat around the table, and we do that sat with our teachers, and we do that sat with our curriculum leaders, and we found that really important. We can look at a child's book, but actually, what do we know about that? What were the issues in the lesson, or what actually were they learning beyond what's in that child's book? Because sometimes, as you'll know yourselves, you'll do a lesson, and sometimes at the end of it, you might think, well, actually, there's not a great deal to show there, but they were able to answer all of the questions, and it's about being able to have that conversation and seeing that in practice when we're going around and having those conversations within learning walks. Something else that they were really impressed with is that we do staff recommended reading, and we have a staff library. Our staff library has an array of books inclusive of SEND. What we actually do as a school is we would ask our staff to do reading around their area, whether it is metacognition, whether that is around SEND, whatever area they choose to look at, but it's always having that slant on teaching and learning and SEND. So some students may, some of our staff, may look at ASD, for example, and they might home in on that. Some of our staff may decide, actually, I want to have a look at something totally different, but how is that going to support our students as well as our SEND staff and our SEND students? So when we're looking at this, it's about ensuring that we have the resources available for our staff, but also giving them time. So what our expectation is that staff will read. They will not only read, but also use those strategies in the classroom, but we actually pay time back. So we have our CPD days, and we also have days whereby the staff have a choice. They can either use their CPD day to read and to extend their knowledge, but if they've been working on that throughout the year, then they can take that time back, and that's their time, and thanking them for their time as well. So then it would be their day off. So we do that as a buyback, and it's about that collective responsibility that actually, you know, the staff are working really hard, but what can we give back to them as well? And I think that's really quite important. Could you do the next slide for me, please? Thank you. One thing that came out of the Ofsted inspection was questions. So as we've already said, you know, triangulation is just, it's so huge. Everything that was asked of the students, it was asked of the staff, the curriculum leaders, SLT. I had a lengthy conversation with the inspectors. Once I was finished, they wanted me to evidence that and prove it. They asked for EHCPs, they asked for me to take my pupil profiles and to go out across the school and to be able to evidence what I was saying. Is this actually happening? And they wanted to see that. In the classroom, they were asking the students, is this what you would normally have? Can you explain this to me, please? They wanted to know every single avenue, and they really questioned quite hard. And one interesting question really came out from one of our teachers, and they had their feedback. They were one of our departments that had a deep dive, and they asked repeatedly, so what are you doing for your students for SEND? How do you know how to support students with SEND? And the question just kept coming back, and the teacher really felt like they had answered it really well, and I think they were getting quite frustrated. And the Ofsted inspector then changed it to say, but what are you doing personally? And I think that's what really hits home, is that you can answer that, oh, well, the SENCO gives me advice, so external agents and our external agencies will give us recommendations and we use those. But actually, what are you doing personally for that child? What are you trying? How does that fit back in to supporting our students? How does that feed into assess, plan, do, review? How are you part of that process? And it was really about, but what do you know about that student? Apart from what's on a plan, do you know that child? And that spoke real volumes. So it's something that we're working on at the moment, and we're developing that. And that's definitely something that we'll work on even more for our next steps, to get staff more involved in that assess, plan, do, review. But it's certainly a question that will come up in Ofsted, is what are you doing personally as a teacher to support those students? We also are looking on our next steps after in the inspection is to look at reading and it being a real focus for us. So in terms of reading, to give you a bit of sort of context, in year 7 we have 1 in 5 students who have accessed school with an reading age below their chronological reading age. 80% of those students have a reading age below 8 years. And 10% of those students aren't phonetically sound. So we are doing a huge amount of work around this, but it's not just about it being the SEND department or the English department. It's really important that it's around that whole collective responsibility. So we are developing a whole school reading initiative, and it's going to be working across a planned view of texts. The idea is that we'll have them planned across the career of a student from year 7 to year 11, and they'll be able to read texts that enrich a real rich broad selection of reading materials selected for British values and capital culture, to really home in on those. It's about being able to take the reading initiative to improve our reading aids, but also have a love for reading. And I think that's really important. It's not only going to improve reading ages, but it's actually going to allow us to expand students' knowledge and their access to all those fabulous texts that are available. A lot of our students won't have that. They don't have access to that at home, and they wouldn't know how to go to a library and take a book out. And I think it's really about us giving that back to the students and supporting them with that process. So our aim is moving forward, like I say, is to increase that. We're looking at doing a rolling cycle. So we're going to take 1 lesson a week, and it will roll throughout the whole week. So 1 week it'll be lesson 1 on a Monday, the following week it'll be lesson 2 on a Monday, so on and so forth. So we're reading across the broad of the subjects to be able to support our students. We're doing inference training, so it's about being able to teach the students how to predict. It's about being able to teach the students how to read ahead, to imagine what is going on in that story, what could come next. And it's really being able to improve our school data in terms of reading, which, as we know, if we're able to improve that, then we're able to improve the education for our SEND students as well. So there's a lot to think about. I know obviously we've kind of thrown a lot of information at you, but for those of you that are waiting for an inspection, good luck. And if you need anything, then please do get in touch.
As our last case study today, sorry, I was just restarting my video. We have had a few technical problems, so apologies for that. What I would like to do now is just go through some of the questions that have been raised by everyone watching. So I'd like to start with Hayley, if that's all right. There was quite a few questions regarding your pre-teaching. I think everyone thought that was a great idea, but practically, you know, how do you release teachers? And how is that pre-teaching sort of evidence? So, you know, is there any?
So obviously it doesn't happen for every lesson. Obviously that's why we want it to be teacher led, so that the teacher knows exactly what their children need and when they need that. So what the teachers do, we have PPA every morning. So the teachers will take 45 minutes on a morning, half an hour on a morning, and a lot of them do go back slightly earlier to be able to do the pre-teaching in that time. We also do a whole class Reading Plus in Key Stage 2, so we use the Reading Plus programme, and they sometimes would use that time to do their pre-teaching. I'm just going to shut this door, sorry, I've moved rooms. In terms of evidence, depending on what the reason for the pre-teaching is, so if it is just to go through the key concepts and the key vocabulary, it could just be all verbal, and that wouldn't be evidence. However, if it is part of a maths sequence or part of the to pre-teach them a bit of the fluency. We follow the White Rose maths. So if it is to pre-teach a little bit of the fluency to give them that little bit of a head start, that would just go in their maths book as normal. So when we look in their books, not just me as a SENCO, but the maths leader, SLT, we can see what's happened with the pre-teaching and what impact that's had on their what they've done in that lesson as well, how that's impacted that lesson. I hope that makes sense. Does that answer them?
Yeah. Do you think it's a bit easier, Hayley, because you've got such a small setting? Do you think it's easier to timetable?
Yeah, but we don't have full-time TAs, so you know the bigger schools might have the luxury of a full-time TA. We don't have that at all. From year one upwards, we don't have any full-time TAs. So I think it is just being a little bit savvy with your timetable and looking at when the teacher, because obviously it is very important that you're not taking them out of the lesson, and the teacher can't come out the lesson, obviously. But then, you know, it might be that you've got support staff who have maths expertise, and it might be that you use them for your pre-teaching. And you know, some of our interventions are led by our experienced maths support staff. But what we aim to do in our school is have that pre-teaching done by the teacher who knows what the lesson's going to be about, if that makes sense.
Yeah. And Elizabeth's just added in the chat that they use morning assembly time for pre-teaching opportunities, yeah. Which is obviously, if you've got the whole school together, that's when you can use your teacher time. It's about being a bit flexible and grabbing whatever time.
I think it is just looking at your timetable and looking at when it would suit, you know, for what works for our school might not for yours, but you know, just looking at where your subjects are and when you teach what and seeing if you can fit it in.
Yeah. Thanks. We had a request as well to Meg, who obviously isn't here, but we heard her on the video. She's teaching because she couldn't get cover. For the student information example that she talked about, if we've got like an example of those student information sheets. So I will ask her if we can get an anonymised one and we can add it to the slide pack. And I'm just having a look through the chat. I'll give it another sort of minute. And if anyone has any questions for Hayley, Cheryl or Rachel, if you just pop those in, just while I talk about the next session that we have. So the next session is on the 11th of January. And we're really going to be focusing on middle leaders and phase leaders, and we're going to have that reading focus, and we're going to gather together all that data that we've been collecting on all of the Ofsted inspections that have happened in the autumn term, and we're going to share that document as part of the training. So Paula in the chat has said that would the student information sheet be the same as a one-page profile? I'm pretty sure, Pauline, I just haven't seen the example, but I imagine when we have a look, it'd be the same sort of idea of a quick way of sharing information with all staff. Because sometimes, obviously, as you know, the EHCPs can just be so lengthy that it's hard to make that information really accessible. Okay, so it doesn't look like we've had any more questions, so we'll bring it to a close. Thank you to everyone who's persevered despite the sound and video problems. We're going to try and clean up the video, and we have a copy that isn't pixelated, so we will post that. So thank you to everyone who's attending, and hopefully we'll see you in January for session 3.